Imagine this: you're sitting across from someone, and they haven't said a word, but something in the air feels different. Their gaze lingers a second too long, their body shifts toward you, almost instinctively. There's a quiet intensity, not loud, not obvious, but unmistakable. Have you ever felt that? Carl Jung believed that when a man truly falls in love, it's not just emotion, it's archetypal awakening. Deep within every man lives the lover archetype, a primordial force that, when activated, transforms his inner world. He becomes more attuned, more vulnerable, more alive, not because he tries to, but because something ancient in him has been stirred. You won't see it in grand declarations. You'll feel it in the small moments, the way he remembers the tiniest detail you once mentioned, the way time seems to expand when he's near, the way silence between you suddenly feels full. This is not a performance. It's not strategy. It's the unconscious speaking through gestures, presence, energy. So let me ask you, have you ever sensed something deeper from someone, even when they said nothing at all? In this section, we'll explore how Jung's lover archetype shapes male behavior, how love activates a force that rewrites a man's instincts, alters his emotional expression, and speaks a language few are taught to recognize. Let's begin. There comes a moment in a man's life not loud, not planned, when something ancient stirs beneath the surface. It may begin with a glance, a dream, or a feeling he cannot name. But beneath that moment, something profound unfolds. Carl Jung called it the activation of the lover archetype. This is not about attraction, not in the way we casually speak of it. This is not about charm or conquest or chemistry. It is about awakening. A deep, soulful current begins to rise from the unconscious, the place Jung believed housed the forgotten language of the soul. The lover is not just a man who wants. He is a man who remembers. Something about her touches a thread long buried. And in that moment, he is no longer just reacting to the present. He is being drawn into a mirror of his own hidden self. Jung's psychology teaches us that love is not merely a feeling, but a force of individuation. To fall in love, truly, is to encounter the parts of ourselves we had long silenced, the tenderness, the longing, the capacity to feel deeply without needing to control. The lover archetype brings them to the surface. It is eros, not just as physical desire, but a psychic energy, a call toward unity, toward beauty, toward wholeness. Have you ever felt the presence of someone without needing words? Have you ever been in the same room with a man unknown, not through what he said, but through how he listened, how his gaze lingered just a second longer, that something in him had opened? That is the lover speaking, not through declaration, but through presence. He may not understand what is happening. In fact, most men don't, because society teaches men to suppress vulnerability, to hide their longing behind armor. But when the lover is awakened, his unconscious speaks anyway. It speaks through actions, timing, memory, and silence. And if you're listening closely, you'll feel it. This is where Jung's psychology offers a radical truth. The lover is not a weakness, not a regression. He is an archetype of vitality, of creativity, of devotion. When repressed, he turns into addiction, fantasy, or avoidance. But when integrated, he becomes a sacred bridge between the masculine and the soul. So let me ask you, have you mistaken emotional withdrawal for disinterest? Have you assumed silence meant absence? Or have you sensed something deeper trying to reach you beneath the surface? In the next part, we'll explore how the unconscious mind reveals itself not in grand confessions, but in the subtleties most overlooked. Because in Jungian psychology, the heart speaks quietly, but never falsely. There is a silence many men carry that has nothing to do with indifference. It is not the absence of love, but the absence of language for it. Carl Jung believed that within every man resides a complex interplay of archetypes, primordial energies that shape behavior, identity, and expression. Among these, the lover is the most intimate, yet the most repressed. When awakened, it stirs an emotional force so potent that the ego, trained in logic, control, and Anima struggles to make sense of it. How does a man speak of longing when he was taught that desire makes him weak? How can he name vulnerability when his survival once depended on suppressing it? Jungian psychology teaches us that the psyche is not a linear construct but a layered world, where what we cannot express is not forgotten, it is buried. In many men, the lover archetype lives beneath these layers, beneath the stoicism, beneath the silence. It aches to give, to merge, to feel deeply, but it does so behind closed doors, behind tightened jaws and diverted eyes. And so love, for many men, becomes an internal storm, a pressure they cannot release. They offer time instead of words, presence instead of promises, gestures in place of declarations because, somewhere along the way, they were made to believe that showing emotion was a threat to their masculinity. Have you ever felt that a man cared deeply but couldn't say it? That his silence wasn't coldness, but fear that if he opened his mouth, something sacred might spill out and never be returned. This is the tragedy of emotional repression, a wound not only personal, but collective. In psychological terms, it is the splitting of the psyche where the lover is sent into the shadow, not because he is wrong, but because the world has no place for his tenderness. But repression is not removal. What is repressed becomes distorted. The unlived love turns to frustration. The unnamed longing morphs into detachment. Men begin to sabotage the very relationships that awaken them because it is safer to destroy what stirs their soul than to stand naked in front of it. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is not a curse. It is an invitation to every man who has ever struggled to say "I love you," but felt it in his bones. To every woman who has sensed the depth behind a man's silence, this is not absence. This is a man standing at the edge of his emotional threshold, unsure if stepping forward will free him or undo him. And so the work begins not to teach men how to perform love, but to help them remember how to feel it. Not with scripts, but with psychological integration. With space, with safety, with the sacred permission to unfold. Because deep love isn't a performance, it is a return. A return to the parts that were once silenced, but never truly gone. In the next part, we'll explore the subtle signs, the invisible language that reveals when this deeper force has been stirred within him, often before he's ready to speak it aloud. There's a reason love often feels like a mirror, unsettling in its accuracy, unrelenting in its reflection. According to Jungian psychology, what we fall in love with is not always the person in front of us. More often, we are captivated by a part of ourselves we've forgotten, a piece of our soul we've unconsciously placed onto another. This phenomenon, Jung called projection. And when it comes to men and love, it most often appears through a powerful internal image, the anima. The anima is not just a concept. It is the inner feminine soul of every man, a psychological archetype that carries the emotional, intuitive, relational qualities he may have suppressed in himself. And when he encounters a woman who evokes these qualities, something ancient awakens. He may feel drawn to her softness, her depth, the quiet light in her eyes, not because of who she is alone, but because she stirs the part of him he has never dared to meet. He projects the anima onto her, mistaking in a yearning for external destiny. Have you ever sensed that someone saw in you something far bigger than you felt you were? As if you were cast in a story that wasn't your own. That is the pull of the anima, where unconscious longing dresses itself in romance. But what happens when she does not live up to the image? When reality does not reflect the projection? Disappointment sets in, confusion follows. He withdraws not because she changed, but because the veil lifted. This is not the end of love, but the invitation to begin again, this time with awareness. Projection is not a flaw. It is the beginning of awakening. When a man realizes that what he seeks in another is a reflection of what he must reclaim in himself, the real journey begins. In the next part, we will explore how these projections, if left unconscious, create cycles of sabotage and misconnection, and how healing begins the moment we take back the parts of our soul we've cast onto others. Modern science as a language of scans and synapses. Depth psychology speaks in archetypes and dreams. But somewhere in the space between them, between the firing of neurons and the ache of the soul, we begin to understand why love can feel both magnetic and maddening. Neuroscience tells us that when a man feels deeply for someone, his brain releases a cocktail of chemicals: dopamine for desire, oxytocin for bonding, serotonin for emotional regulation. These are not just fleeting reactions, they are biological signatures of attachment. But Jungian psychology reminds us, this attachment is never just to another person. It is to a symbol, a reflection, an unconscious image brought to life through the force of projection. The lover archetype awakens not only hormones, but hidden wounds, unmet needs, unspoken longings. And so, when a man says, "I can't stop thinking about her," it's not just biochemistry. It's also the psyche whispering, she's the key, not just to pleasure or connection, but to something buried inside him. Something he has been searching for far longer than he knows. Have you ever noticed how love can bring both euphoria and fear? How getting close to someone stirs both excitement and defensiveness? That is the psyche and the nervous system in conflict. The heart says yes, but the body, shaped by past pain, prepares to run. In this way, neuroscience confirms what depth psychology has long intuited. Love is not safe. It is not neat. It is not rational. Because love activates the oldest parts of our brain, the ones that remember heartbreak before memory, the ones that learn to fear vulnerability. But this is where transformation begins. When you realize that your reactions, your pullbacks, your cravings, your emotional storms are not signs of weakness, but signals from your inner world, clues from your nervous system, echoes from your unconscious, invitations to heal. As Jung might say, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when this inner storm goes unexamined, when desire is confused with destiny, and emotional projection becomes the silent architect of our most painful love stories. Love, when it's real, rarely enters through the front door. It slips in quietly, unannounced, through the unconscious, through glances held too long, through small gestures repeated without knowing why, through a sudden stillness in a man who was once all motion. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious mind doesn't hide our truth, it reveals it, but not with words, with patterns, with symbols, with instinct. So how do you know when a man is truly in love? You don't wait for him to say it. You watch what his psyche says without permission. First, his eyes. Not just the way he looks at you, but the way his gaze softens in your presence. Jung called the eyes the windows to the soul, and when a man loves, his eyes forget how to lie. They linger, they follow, they reflect not possession, but recognition. Second, his attention. You mention something in passing, your favorite book, a childhood memory. The way you take your tea, and weeks later, he brings it up. Why? Because in his unconscious, you've become a symbol, a priority. Third, his space begins to shift. He makes time where there was none, rearranges plans without complaint. Not because he's trying to impress you, but because something in him needs you close. Fourth, he starts remembering the smallest things. Not just what you say, but how you say it. He picks up on your moods, your patterns, your silences. Fifth, his presence steadies. He doesn't disappear after intensity. He stays, even when it's inconvenient, even when there are no rewards. Sixth, his protectiveness awakens not out of control, but out of care. He notices when you're uncomfortable. He softens when you're vulnerable. His instincts begin to orbit you. Seventh, he includes you in his future not as a promise, but as a presence. His language subtly shifts from I to we. And finally, he becomes emotionally visible. The man who once deflected now begins to reveal. Not all at once, but in pieces, in glimpses. in the moments when he forgets to be guarded. These signs, Jung would say, are not conscious decisions. They are psychic truths surfacing through the body, through behavior, through a kind of soul recognition. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into why so many women miss these signs and how our cultural expectations have taught us to look for love in the wrong places. We fall in love not with people, but with the stories we place upon them. Jung called this projection, the unconscious act of casting our inner images onto others, like a movie playing across someone else's face. When a man sees a woman and feels something awaken in him, it's often not her he sees at first, it's his anima, the inner feminine archetype that lives within his psyche. The part of him that dreams, feels, longs for beauty, for warmth, for soul. She becomes the mirror, and he the seeker of a forgotten part of himself. But projection is both magic and illusion. In the early stages, it feels like destiny. You finish each other's sentences, you see signs in everything. Time bends around your presence together, but eventually, the illusion begins to crack. The person you thought they were begins to dissolve into the person they truly are. And this is where most love stories end or transform. Carl Jung believed that true love doesn't begin at infatuation. It begins the moment projection fades and presence begins. Can you love the real person behind the image? Can you meet them not as a fantasy, but as a flawed, sovereign, evolving soul? Because here's the truth. When the anima projection fades, what remains is an opportunity to love not what they reflect, but who they are, and more importantly, to retrieve the parts of yourself that you projected outward. The journey from projection to presence is the heart of Jungian psychology. It asks you to take back your fantasy and give the other person their humanity. It asks you to stop seeking your missing piece in someone else and instead become whole within yourself. This is not the death of love, it is its transfiguration, because when the mask falls, and both people choose to stay not for who they imagined each other to be, but for who they truly are, that is when love becomes sacred. In the final part, we'll explore how this path from fantasy to presence not only transforms relationships, but leads us to the deepest goal of all, the psychological and spiritual wholeness Jung called individuation. Love, when seen through the lens of depth psychology, is no longer just a feeling. It becomes a mirror reflecting back the pieces of you that long to return home. The path of true connection both to another and to yourself is not paved by perfection, performance, or possession. It's walked in presence, in choosing each other not for what you lack, but for what you are becoming. Carl Jung called this the path of individuation, the unfolding of your whole self through the trials of love, loss, projection, and reintegration. And few things in life accelerate this journey more than falling in love not with a fantasy, but with someone who sees you clearly and asks you to meet them with the same clarity. So if something in this journey stirred something in you, let it be a beginning. Begin with the way you listen to your longing. Begin with the way you question your patterns. Begin with the way you hold yourself gently, honestly, without apology. You don't need to rush to a solution. You don't need to be anyone other than who you are, right here. Thank you for being here, for allowing this space into your heart. And if you're ready to continue walking the path of depth, healing, and self-reclamation, this is your invitation. Not to chase love, but to become it. Because the most sacred relationship we will ever have is the one between your soul and your truth.